Once upon a time, there was a couple named Bright and Sandra. After they got married, they were not fortunate to give birth in time. It took them 5 years of crying and praying before they were able to give birth to their daughter, Naomi. After they gave birth to Naomi, they couldn't stop thanking God for giving them Naomi when all their hopes were lost. One beautiful evening, after they had eaten dinner that night and retired to bed, Naomi was lying down in between the couple. Mr. Bright just kept staring at his little daughter and smiling.
"Tell me the reason behind this smile tonight,"
Sandra asked her husband, also smiling with him.
Who would have ever thought that we would have been a parent someday? I hope you remember all we went through,
Mr. Bright asked Sandra.
"Can I ever forget? I was called a barren woman. We were mocked for 5 good years. I got different advice from different friends. Old women called me aside and tried to give me various solutions. Doctors had different things to say each time we went to them. People always pointed to me as I walked past. Even some women in the church used to mock me. I was referred to as the fair barren. I almost committed suicide after a fellow woman told me to my face that I was a man and that was why I couldn't give my husband children."
Sandra said all this and tears rolled down her cheeks.
It's okay. Those are in the past now. God has given us Naomi and blessed us, our bundle of joy,
Mr. Bright said with a smile.
"Her 7th birthday is coming next week. Our daughter will be 7 years old,"
Sandra said with a smile. They both just kept staring at Naomi, who was sleeping peacefully. Then Mr. Bright stretched his hand and turned off the light and bid his wife good night. The next day, Mr. Bright was so tangled at work that he forgot it was time to bring Naomi back from school. It was the weekend, and Mr. Bright was the one who took Naomi back during the weekends. It was already 40 minutes after dismissal, but Mr. Bright was not yet back with Naomi. Sandra decided to wait a bit longer, thinking it was traffic. After a few more minutes, she became worried and called her husband on the phone. Mr. Bright was shocked that almost an hour had flown by after Naomi's school dismissal time. He pleaded with his wife to quickly go get her because he was still very busy. Sandra left what she was doing immediately and started heading towards Naomi's school. She was already 55 minutes late, and it took another 15 minutes to get to Naomi's school. Sandra entered a bus, and just after a 5-minute drive, she got stuck in traffic. The traffic was so bad that Sandra decided it was best she calms down and searched for a bike that would be faster, because the bike riders always have a way of maneuvering the traffic. After walking for a while in haste, Sandra stopped the bike. She tried hopping on the bike, and then she remembered she had forgotten her purse inside the bus she had entered earlier. Sandra didn't know if she was to continue to the school or go back to get her purse. She asked the bike man to go while she goes to take her phone because her phone was inside the purse. Sandra started walking back in quick steps, looking for the bus she had entered earlier. Meanwhile, back at the school, Naomi sat outside with some of her classmates who were waiting for their parents to come and take them home. Some who had older siblings went home with them. As parents came taking their kids in their numbers, Naomi only sat, wondering if her father had forgotten her.
"Naomi, Your father is not coming today?
One of her classmates asked her as she left with her mother. Naomi was already tired of waiting. She was so hungry. She didn't eat the whole day because she didn't like the food her mother had prepared and put into her lunchbox. Naomi stood up and decided to go home alone. She left the school with her bag and lunchbox. She started walking home all alone while carrying her lunchbox. After a few minutes' walk, Naomi's lunchbox fell from her hand and rolled into the main road. She tried going to pick it up. Someone tried calling out to Naomi because of the speeding car coming towards her in a haste. The man driving the car quickly stepped on his brakes, but it was already too late. He had knocked Naomi down. The man came down immediately and saw Naomi lying down almost lifeless and bleeding. Before people would come any closer, the man carried Naomi into his car. He reversed with her in his car and drove off in a haste. As Sandra walked back in quick steps to where she had alighted from the bus earlier, she noticed some bus drivers were turning around to follow another route because of the traffic ahead. She increased her pace trying to find the bus she had come down from earlier, but she couldn't seem to identify the bus. It looked like the bus had turned around with the others. Sandra carried her hand on her head in confusion. She had just lost her purse containing her phone. She wanted to call her husband, but she couldn't. She couldn't pay for a bike either because she had no money on her. She decided to trek down to the school and then call her husband with one of the teacher's phones when she got to the school. After so many minutes of walking under the scorching sun, Sandra arrived in front of the school gate. She was sweating profusely like someone who had engaged in a marathon race. The environment was very calm, unlike the usual time when there were kids around the vicinity. Sandra's only hope was that her daughter was inside the gate, seeing that there was no padlock on it. As she reached out to open the gate, she saw the headmistress coming out of the gate holding a padlock to close the gates. "Good afternoon, ma," Sandra greeted, trying to force a smile. "Good afternoon, my dear. Why are you sweating so much?" the headmistress asked, looking at Sandra. "I'm sorry. I'm so late. It seems everyone had left already," Sandra asked, looking around. "Yes, it's already 4 p.m. and everyone has left. Today is Friday and we close so early," the headmistress answered. "What about my daughter?" Sandra asked, fixing her gaze on the headmistress as she locked up the gate. "Your daughter? No one is here. Why not call your husband and know if he has her? He comes to pick her on Fridays," the headmistress answered. "I know my husband too well, and he can't ask me to come to take my daughter from school if he has already done that," Sandra said, already having mixed feelings. "Why not call him?" the headmistress suggested. "That's the problem. I can't. I was in a hurry and I forgot my purse with my phone inside the bus I'd entered earlier when there was traffic. My phone and the little money I had on me is all gone. I just wanted to come and pick up my daughter first before talking about my phone." "Then how did you pay the bus driver when you came down?" "I had money in my hand already and I just..." "Oh, ma, my phone is not my problem. Where is my daughter? Where is Naomi?" Sandra asked, already having a bad feeling. "Take my phone and call your husband. Let's see if he took her," the headmistress said, dipping her hand into her bag and bringing out her phone. She gave it to Sandra, who collected it and dialed Bright's number immediately. Mr. Bright picked up the call immediately, and Sandra asked him if he came and took their daughter from school. Mr. Bright told her he had been calling her and she was not picking up her calls. He wanted to know if they were back home. He couldn't understand what he was hearing over the phone, that his princess was missing. He told Sandra that he was coming over immediately. Mr. Bright hung up the call, and Sandra could feel the tears building up in her eyes. "Where is my daughter?" Sandra asked the headmistress in a teary voice. The headmistress was dumbfounded. She had no answer to the questions Sandra just asked her. She calmed Sandra down, and she called the teacher in charge of Naomi's class. She asked the teacher to come back to school as there was a case of a missing pupil. Sandra didn't know where she would start from to look for her only daughter. Tears just kept rolling down her cheeks as she waited for the teacher in charge of Naomi's class. She was restless and just kept looking around, hoping to lay her eyes on Naomi. It took a few minutes and the teacher came back to the school. She was asked who had taken Naomi. The teacher said Naomi was sitting with her best friend Anita outside waiting for her father. She saw Anita's mother coming to take Anita. After a while, she didn't see Naomi anymore. She thought her father had taken her. Sandra asked the teacher to call Anita's mother on the phone and find out if Naomi had followed her home. The teacher was scrolling down her contact list looking for Anita's mother's number when Mr. Bright came down from the bike and walked towards the rest in a quick pace. A call came into the headmistress's phone. She picked it up. "Hello, madam. I think one of your students met with an accident a few minutes ago," the voice said over the phone. The headmistress shifted a bit to where she won't be heard. She asked what the pupil looked like. The description fitted that of Naomi. She slowly brought down the phone. She didn't know how she was going to tell the couple that their only daughter had been involved in a life-threatening accident. More still, no one knows where she was carried off to by the man who had knocked her down. The headmistress just kept staring at Bright, who was consoling Sandra, who cried bitterly. It seemed like Anita's mother just told them Naomi wasn't with her. A tear almost dropped off the cheek of the headmistress in confusion and pity for the couple. Earlier, when Naomi was hit by a speeding car, the man who had knocked her down came down from his car immediately. He saw Naomi lying down almost lifeless, and without wasting time, he carried Naomi into his car. He reversed his car and drove off. He was praying so hard that she doesn't die before he gets to the hospital. David was on the phone talking with a business associate. He had actually come for a visit and was going back to his city. He didn't see Naomi. He was lost in the call he was making. He only heard someone's loud cry which drew his attention. But before he could step on his brakes, he had already knocked the little girl down. So he immediately came down and carried Naomi into his car. He didn't want to take any chances in saving the life of the little girl. What kind of temptation is this? David asked himself as he drove quickly to a hospital he knew distant away. He was sweating profusely as he drove at his maximum speed. When he got to the hospital, he carried Naomi into the hospital. She was already bleeding from her mouth and her head. It seemed like Naomi's head had first landed on the iron in front of his jeep without falling to the ground. The nurses took charge immediately. The doctor was busy with another patient. When he was told of the emergency, he quickly came to see the new patient. David was pacing around the hospital. He didn't know what to do. The doctor was really taking quite long inside the hospital room, and David grew anxious by the moment. He didn't want to hear any bad news. The doctor came out with a sad look. David walked up to him to ask him how the little girl was doing. The doctor looked at David and shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. The accident was really fatal. We examined her thoroughly and found that she has internal brain bleeding. We have tried to control it with some drugs and injections. She needs immediate surgery for her to survive," the doctor said in a very concerned tone. "A surgery? Go ahead with the surgery, doctor. The money won't be a problem. I will sign any document necessary. I don't want that little girl to die, please, doctor," David begged with his hands together. "I'm sorry, but we don't have the necessary equipment here. You will have to take her somewhere else. I will give you some written notes." David didn't know his way around where he was. He didn't know which hospital had the equipment that was needed for the surgery, and so he decided to take Naomi to his city. He needed her to get better before starting to look for who her parents were. David asked the doctor if he could take Naomi on a 4 to 5 hours journey drive to another hospital from where he came from. The doctor gave his approval and gave some written notes to David and gave another injection to the little girl. Back at Naomi's school, "Sir," the headmistress called out softly to Mr. Bright. Both Mr. Bright and Sandra immediately turned to see why the headmistress was calling. "I just received a call. Your daughter, Naomi, was involved in an accident." "My daughter was involved in an accident? Where? Where did it happen?" Sandra ran and held the headmistress, asking her impatiently. "Few minutes down the street," the headmistress answered. Sandra ran off immediately towards where she was told, without waiting for the rest. Mr. Bright immediately followed his wife, running towards the said accident scene. When they got there, they were told that the man who knocked her down had taken her. Maybe he had taken her to the hospital. Since no one knew which hospital Naomi was taken to, the teacher, the headmistress, and the couple stopped a taxi and left for the closest hospital. In the taxi, Mr. Bright wanted to burst out to the headmistress, but he knew it was all his fault. Sandra held Bright tight, hoping for her daughter to be in the hospital, as streams of tears rolled down her cheeks. Both the teacher and the headmistress also hoped that they would find Naomi in good health. When they got to the hospital, Sandra was the first to run into the hospital. She asked the nurses if they had seen a little girl in school uniform who got involved in an accident. The nurses checked and there was no record of a little girl involved in an accident. Sandra was disappointed, but still moved on to the next hospital. By the time they got to the third hospital and asked about the case of a little girl who had an accident, they were told that a little girl who fitted their description was brought into the hospital. It was a big hospital, so they were asked to wait while they find which ward the girl was taken into. Sandra was relieved that finally she was going to see her only daughter. She only hoped that Naomi was okay. They all waited impatiently for someone to come and take them to see Naomi. Then the doctor came out. he came to see those looking for the little girl. "Doctor, how is my daughter? Where is she? Can I see her?" The doctor was asked by Sandra in tears. "Yes, doctor, please, can we see our daughter?" That was when the doctor realized that those standing in front of him were the parents of the said girl. "I'm so sorry. Are you the parents of the little girl?" the doctor asked, shifting his gaze from Sandra to Mr. Bright. "Yes, we are," Mr. Bright and Sandra answered anxiously and nodding their heads. "Sorry to break this sad news to you then. Your daughter was involved in a serious accident which nearly took her life. When she was rushed here, she was bleeding from her head. I had thought that was all till I decided to examine her scrupulously, and I found that she had an internal brain bleeding." "My daughter has an internal bleeding. Where is she? Where is my daughter? I want to see her, please," Sandra asked with tears rolling down her cheeks. The doctor heaved a sigh and continued. "Ma, she needed to be operated to stop the bleeding completely. I had given her some drugs and injections to keep the blood from flowing in. Our hospital doesn't have the necessary equipment for the surgery, so the man who had brought her here decided he would take Naomi to a big city so that she can be treated." Which city? Which city, doctor? Do you have his number?" "I don't know the city he lives in. Neither do I have his number," the doctor said in a disappointing tone. Sandra turned slowly, looked at her husband, and then fell down and fainted. They tried immediately to revive her in the hospital. When Sandra woke up, all she did was cry bitterly, asking for her only child. "Why me? Why Naomi? After 5 years, God, after 5 years, you sent Naomi to me. Why this huge temptation? Where is my Naomi? Where is my Naomi?" Sandra kept saying in tears loudly. Mr. Bright tried to hold himself. His charming princess was on the verge of death and no one even knew where she was. He held his wife and tried consoling her. Sandra refused to go home. She wanted her daughter to be brought back to her. The headmistress and the teacher couldn't go home either. They just looked at the couple who were in pains and couldn't help keeping their tears back in. It was getting dark already and they needed to go back home. Mr. Bright convinced Sandra to follow him back home. The headmistress begged Mr. Bright not to take out his anger on their school as they would put their hands together in looking for Naomi. Mr. Bright wasn't in the mood to start causing havoc. He just wanted to take his wife home because she has not been herself. Going after the school was not going to bring back his daughter. He solemnly blamed himself and hoped the man brings back his daughter alive to them. Back to Mr. David. He was speeding a lot, and when he was stopped by the police, he showed them the report written by the doctor coupled with the notes, and they let him pass. He drove for hours and finally got to his city. It was already dark, but he drove straight to the hospital. He gave them the notes the doctors had given to him. Naomi was quickly taken into the theater while Mr. David made the necessary payments. The surgeon was called, and luckily he was still in the hospital. He had wanted to leave a while ago, but it was as if something kept him back. He immediately went in to see Naomi. Mr. David was in the waiting room. He was praying and hoping Naomi would come out safe. He kept pacing around and rubbing his hand on his head. His phone kept vibrating in his pocket. He brought it out and it was his wife, Tina, calling. She had called him so many times and he never picked. He picked up the call and his wife asked him why he wasn't back home yet, after telling her hours ago that he was on his way home. Mr. David explained everything to his wife. She asked where he was so she would come immediately. It took a few minutes, then Tina arrived at the hospital. She went and met her husband where he was seated and sweating. She asked him how it all happened and he told her. Tina was concerned. She decided to wait with her husband for the outcome of the ongoing surgery. The surgery took a very long time. Once in a while, a nurse will come out and then go back into the theater. Mr. David and Tina kept sleeping and waking up at intervals in the hospital waiting room. They earnestly wanted Naomi to be healed. Time was crawling, but finally, the doctor came out. He was wearing a smile on his face. Mr. David was the first to see the doctor. He tried standing up, and Tina, who was sitting beside him, woke up too. "Doctor, how is she? Hope the surgery was successful," Mr. David asked the doctor anxiously. "By the grace of God, and not ours, the little girl is safe and out of danger. Yes, the surgery was successful." "Yes. Oh, thank God," Mr. David said out loud while his wife hugged him happily. "Please bring down your voices," the doctor said in a low tone. Okay, Mr. David said. "She needs a lot of resting time. She's likely to lose a part of her memory, which will only come back with time by God's grace. Also, she may not be able to talk well for a while. I have given some list of drugs to the nurse. You get them and make sure she takes them as prescribed. She really needs a lot of love and care from you both to get well soon." "Can we see her now?" Tina asked softly. "Sure, but she needs no disturbance. She needs maximum rest," the doctor said and walked out. The couple thanked the doctor and walked into the hospital room. Immediately, Tina walked into the room and set her eyes on Naomi. Streams of tears ran down her cheeks. She started sobbing bitterly while Mr. David tried to console her. The headmistress left with a heavy heart. She knew Naomi was the only daughter of Mr. Bright. She knew what it felt like for a child to be missing. She blamed the teacher in charge for being so careless. The class teacher wanted to defend herself, but she knew that nothing she would say would justify the fact that Naomi got missing under her watch. She only prayed and hoped for Naomi to be safe wherever she was. Mr. Bright stopped a taxi, which would take him and his wife back home. He kept consoling her as they drove back home together. When they got home, Mr. Bright began to make calls, creating awareness that his daughter was missing. He wanted to go to the police station, but he couldn't leave his wife all alone in the condition she was in. Sandra sat on the chair in the living room, feeling so weak. It felt as if she had just lost a part of herself. She wondered why such a heavy temptation would come to her. She couldn't blame her husband. She knew it wasn't intentional on his side. But she wondered why, of all days, it should be the same day that traffic would hold her up. If only there was no traffic, she might have gotten to school before Naomi met with the accident. Sandra stood up slowly. Then she walked towards her room in slow steps after wiping her tears. "Where are you going to, Sandy?" Mr. Bryce asked, looking at his wife. Sandra just shook her head from left to right and kept walking towards her room. She entered her room and knelt down beside her bed. "Father, I know you won't let anything happen to the only child you've given me. I know you will heal her, even though she's not here with me. Whatever hospital she has been taken to, let her be healed, because I trust in you, Lord, in the name of Jesus. Amen." Mr. Bright responded loudly. Sandra turned and looked at him. He had followed her into the room. Mr. Bright consoled his wife. They had no appetite for food. He took his wife to the bathroom and helped her take a shower. After they were done, they retired to bed. Both Mr. Bright and Sandra couldn't find sleep, as lots of questions kept running through their minds. Who had taken Naomi? Why did he leave for another city with Naomi without their consent? Was Naomi really safe out there? How will they get to see their only daughter again? Tina started sobbing bitterly as she saw the condition of Naomi. Mr. David held his wife and took her out of the room. The doctor had warned them not to disturb Naomi to avoid any complication. Years ago, when Mr. David got married to Tina, Tina got pregnant for the first time. The couple were so happy for their incoming child. It took only a few weeks and Tina had a miscarriage. She cried because she couldn't tell what actually caused the miscarriage. She took in again. This time, she tried being careful and avoided everything the doctor told her to avoid. Finally, she gave birth to a baby boy. Mr. David and Tina were so happy. They called their little boy Pascal. After the birth of Pascal, the doctor came with a sad news that Tina won't be able to take in anymore due to some complications which she had. Mr. David and Tina were not that worried because they had gotten their bundle of joy and they never wanted many children in the first place. Pascal grew into a very smart child. He was admired by many because of how intelligent he was. He became his parents' pride. As time rode by, Pascal fell sick. He was taken to the hospital for treatment, and after some treatment, he got better. After a few weeks, he got sick again. He was once again taken to the same hospital and he got better. It suddenly became a habit for Pascal to fall sick after every week. It didn't disturb Mr. David and Tina that much because they had money to buy drugs for their son. Pascal then began to lose weight and his sickness became so serious. That was when Tina suggested that they change to another hospital. Mr. David agreed and Pascal was taken to another hospital. When they got to the hospital, a doctor was called because of how serious Pascal's case was. After much checkup with the doctor, he called the couple into his office, leaving Pascal lying on the hospital bed. The doctor told David and Tina that their son had leukemia, blood cancer. He told them that leukemia was controllable and treatable in children. But Pascal's case had reached its peak and he could die at any moment. He advised Mr. David and his wife to go and spend their last moments with their son. Tina cried her eyes out in the doctor's office. Then she went with David to go and see their son. When they arrived, Pascal was just staring at his parents with his eyes partly opened. The couples tried their best to hide their tears. Pascal smiled at his mother while holding her tight. Suddenly, Tina could feel Pascal's grip loosening up. She looked at his son and realized that Pascal was gone. She shook him vigorously, trying to wake him up, but he was really gone. Mr. David stood looking at his son, and tears ran down his cheeks, while Tina hugged Pascal, crying her eyes out. Looking at Naomi, who was lying down with bandages, made Tina remember how her son had given up the ghost on a hospital bed while smiling at her. Who knows? Who knows if she's the only one her parents have, just like us? How would they cope without their daughter? Tina asked her husband in tears. Tomorrow morning, I'll go back and look for our parents, using the name on the school uniform, Mr. David said, still consoling his wife. The next morning, Mr. Bright woke up. He sat on his bed, thinking of how he was going to find his only daughter. He decided he was going to go to the police station and lay a complaint about his missing daughter. A call came through his phone. It was from the proprietress of the school. She was calling to plead for forgiveness and assure him that the school was going to help and make sure Naomi is brought back to him. Mr. Bright knew that those words only came because she was afraid of losing her school. He only wanted his daughter to be found and nothing more. So he left for the police station to lay a complaint about his missing daughter. The police assured Mr. Bright that they would try their best to bring his daughter back to him. By the time Mr. Bright came back from the police station, he wanted to go to work, but in a second thought, he decided to go back home and be with his wife. He got back home and discovered that the door was open. He had asked Sandra to shut the door behind him. Mr. Bright opened the door slowly to know why the door was still left open. Back at the hospital, Mr. David went back to where Naomi was lying with his wife, Tina. She hadn't moved ever since the surgery was done. She lay still with the white clothes she was changed into, and the bandage on her head had a slight stain of blood. The couple just sat on an empty bed opposite where Naomi lay. She's so beautiful and adorable, Tina said, hugging her husband as they stared at Naomi. Yes, she is. Her parents must be lucky to have her. Thank God the operation was successful, Mr. David said with a smile. He looked at his watch and the time said 2 minutes past 1 a.m. I think you need to go back home and rest, my dear. You have to be at work early, remember? Mr. David said to his wife. Tina tapped her phone and saw that it was early morning already. She told her husband that she wouldn't be able to find sleep if she went back to the house. Mr. David tried persuading his wife, but she wanted to stay with him and Naomi. He felt the way Tina just kept staring at Naomi with so much love. As time went by, Tina slept off on her husband's laps while Mr. David leaned on the wall, sitting on the bed. The reflection of the early morning sun found its way into the room where Mr. David and his wife were. Noises of people moving around inside the hospital woke Mr. David and Tina up. They were tired. The first thing they did was to check on Naomi. She was still sleeping and had not yet opened her eyes. Mr. David left the room and went to get the nurse that was attending to Naomi. He asked for the uniform that Naomi was putting on earlier before they had her clothes changed. The nurse gave the uniform to Mr. David. He went outside and placed the uniform perfectly at the back of his seat. After staring at Naomi for a while, Tina left the hospital room. She was already running late for work. She left Mr. David in the hospital and left for their house. Mr. David gave the nurse some tip and asked her to look after Naomi. Then he left the hospital and went towards his car. Something surprised Mr. David. He had 2 flat tires. He never noticed it when he had come to keep Naomi's uniform. He had just 1 spare tire, so he decided to walk down the road to get help. Few minutes later, Mr. David came back with someone and his tire was changed. It was time for him to travel back to the city where he had knocked Naomi down to look for her parents.
As Mr. David approached the said city, something strange happened. He turned to pick up the uniform which he had placed perfectly at the back of his car. But to his greatest bewilderment, the uniform wasn't there anymore. Mr. David stepped on his brakes immediately. He decided to clear off the road and search for the uniform well. He parked his car and came down. He searched for the uniform, but it was nowhere to be found. He picked up his phone from inside the car and called his wife. When she picked, he asked her if she was the one that took out the uniform he had placed inside his car. His wife told him she never touched the uniform. Mr. David stood for a while, wondering what was going on. First, his tires were deflated. Now, all of a sudden, the uniform he had placed at the back of his car seat was there no more. If his wife said she did not take out the uniform from the back of the seat, then who did? When Mr. David had called his wife, she was with her best friend in the office. Tina's friend, Deborah, had come to visit Tina at her workplace. She asked her why her husband will be asking about a school uniform. "Have you adopted a child without letting me know?" "Me, your best friend?" Deborah asked jokingly. Tina told Deborah the story of how her husband had knocked down a girl after he had gone to visit someone in another city. Deborah was touched by all Tina just told her. From the description that Tina made, the little girl was about the age of Pascal, and she knew that the incident would definitely make Tina remember her dead son, Pascal. "I would really like to see this little girl," Deborah said, with so much concern in her face. Tina told her that they would be leaving in the next 30 minutes to go see the girl in the hospital and know if she had woken up. Back at Naomi's house, her father, Mr. Bright, who had just come back from the police station after reporting about his missing daughter, met the door to his house open.
He had warned his wife earlier to shut the doors, but he was surprised to find the door open. Mr. Bright opened the door slowly, and his wife was not in the sitting room. The whole place was so quiet. He bolted the door behind him and went further into his room, but his wife was not there. He went to Naomi's room and slowly opened the door. There he saw Sandra, seated on the floor and just looking at Naomi's clothes that were on her little wall hanger. Then she took Naomi's teddy bear and held it tightly to herself as streams of tears ran down her cheeks. Mr. Bright was so broken, seeing the state his wife was in. He went towards her and consoled her tightly. Sandra never knew her husband was already back. She held the teddy bear tight and the tears ran down her cheeks. He then lifted his wife from the floor where she was seated. He wiped Sandra's tears with his hands. "What did the police say? Will they find her? Did they find my Naomi?" Sandra asked. "I just reported the case, my dear. I know the police will do their best to find our baby," Mr. Bright answered, trying to give hopes to his wife. What if Naomi didn't make it out of the operation room? What if that was the reason why the man who knocked her down didn't come to look for us? Sandra began to ask again as tears started all over to roll down her cheeks. "Don't be pessimistic, Sandy. We will find our daughter and she will be okay," Mr. Bright said, trying to be the carrier of hope for himself and his wife. "Go and freshen up. We will eat out and then we'll go to the hospital and wait for the man. Hopefully he may come back to the hospital," Mr. Bright said to his wife. A few minutes later, Sandra was done in the shower. She wore her clothes and then left the house with her husband. They arrived at an eatery to eat, but Sandra had no appetite. Any little girl that passed looked like Naomi in her eyes. Sandra didn't have the appetite to eat, so Mr. Bright packaged some of the food and took it with him. He left for the hospital with Sandra because they wanted to know if the man had stopped by. Back at the road, Mr. David kept wondering what was actually going on. He knew his wife too well and she wasn't the type of woman to tell him lies. But he wondered who else would have taken the uniform. He had already made up his mind to look for Naomi's parents, and he wasn't going to stop halfway. He knew what both him and his wife had to go through when they lost their only son, Pascal. He needed to find the girl's parents earlier. Uniform or no uniform, I am going to look for the parents of that little girl. Who knows what they are going through, Mr. David said, and entered into his car. He started driving into the city and towards the direction of the accident scene. But the more he drove, the more confused he got. He couldn't actually identify the scene where the accident has taken place because he was in a haste. The first place he stopped and asked questions, it seemed like he was at the wrong place because there was no accident recorded there yesterday. Time was speeding by and Mr. David needed to find the girl's parents. He thought about going to the police station, but then another thought came to his mind. He thought it right to go back to the hospital where he had taken Naomi to. He knew the hospital so well because it was by the roadside. Perhaps Naomi's parents may have come there in search of their daughter. So he went back into his car and drove towards the hospital. She picked up her car keys and left for the hospital with Deborah. Deborah asked Tina who would have taken the uniform her husband had called her earlier about. Tina said she had no idea because she never touched the uniform. It felt strange to Deborah, but she decided not to talk about it. When they both got to the hospital, Tina took Deborah to the ward where Naomi was kept. Naomi was still lying motionless on the bed with bandage on her head. What a cute little girl. I wonder what her parents are going through, Deborah said with a mixed countenance. All I want is for her to get better, Tina said, holding Naomi's hand and trying to smile. She could feel the little girl's finger forming a grip on her hand. I think she's finally awake, Tina said, feeling so much happiness. Both her and Deborah focused on the little girl, waiting for her to open her eyes. Suddenly, the little girl's grip on Tina loosened and she started jerking like someone going through a seizure. Tina got really scared. Doctor! Doctor! Tina called out, running out of the hospital room. A nurse came running towards her direction to know what the problem was. Tina told the nurse that Naomi suddenly started shaking. The nurse asked another nurse to go and call the doctor while she ran in to go and see Naomi. Luckily, the doctor was around and he came quickly to see the condition of Naomi. Deborah and Tina were asked to step outside while he attended to Naomi. Tina went outside immediately and called her husband on the phone. She told him that it seemed Naomi's problem was getting worse and that she was so scared of what was going to happen next. Mr. David had already arrived at the hospital. He came down from his car and was about to lock his car up when a call came into his phone. From the way his wife sounded, he felt as if the surgery was done with complications. He became so worried and couldn't bring himself to go into the hospital. He entered back into his car. After a few minutes, Mr. David called his wife on the phone asking if there was any news about the little girl. His wife told him that the doctor was still inside with Naomi and no news yet. She was almost in tears. Lots of questions started popping up inside Mr. David's head. What if the surgery wasn't successful? What if the little girl dies? What will you tell her parents? What compensation do you think your money can give? Can your money replace their dead child? Do you think they will let you go scot-free? As the questions kept racing through Mr. David's head, he suddenly became scared. He knew finding the girl's parents was the right thing to do, but he couldn't bear looking them in their eyes and telling them that their child is dead in case something went wrong. Mr. David reversed his car around and left the hospital. He was going back to where he came from. Whoever you guys are, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I promise to do my best to make sure your daughter gets well. I pray she gets well and I'll return her to you. I promise, Mr. David said out loud as he drove out. Mr. Bright and Sandra waited and waited at the hospital, but no one showed up yet. Mr. Bright left his wife and went outside the hospital. He called the police to know if there was any news yet, but the police had no news or lead about their daughter. Mr. Bright saw a jeep fitting the description the doctor had given. The jeep was black in color with a bull bar. The car drove into the hospital's vicinity, a distance away from where he stood. The man in the jeep came down. He answered a call and entered back into his car. Mr. Bright stood for a while just observing the car. He wanted to go and ask questions, but he felt as if it was wrong. When he finally got the courage to ask questions, The car reversed and left the hospital quickly without entering the hospital. Mr. Bright heaved a heavy sigh. Then he went back inside to see his wife who he had left. She was lying down on the waiting seat inside the hospital. Mr. Bright tried touching his wife and realized she was having a high temperature. "Your temperature is high, Sandy," Mr. Bright said. Sandra sat up with her face looking pale. "Don't do this to yourself. Don't add to our problems, please," Mr. Bright said, holding his wife. Just then, the doctor walked towards where Mr. Bright and Sandra were seated. "Doctor," Mr. Bright called, running towards the doctor. The doctor, who was actually coming towards their direction, stopped a bit as Mr. Bright ran up to him. "Doctor, my wife's temperature is high and it seems like she has suddenly fallen sick," Mr. Bright said to the doctor. The doctor walked to where Sandra was seated. He felt her temperature with his hands and he asked her how she was feeling, and Sandra explained her condition to the doctor. "I assure you that your daughter is safe and well. The man who had taken your daughter seemed like a nice man and all he wanted was for her to be okay. Don't be hard on yourself, okay?" the doctor said to Sandra in a consoling tone. "Can I see you privately?" the doctor said, looking at Mr. Bright. "Sure," Mr. Bright answered and followed the doctor. "Sir, your wife is going through the trauma of your missing child. I will advise you call some of her siblings to be around her. If care is not taken, she may go after her life." The doctor said this, and then he wrote down a list of some drugs Mr. Bright had to buy from the pharmacy. He handed the piece of paper to him and was about walking out. "Excuse me, doctor. Please, can I ask you a question?" Mr. Bright said, calling back the attention of the doctor. "Yes, go ahead," the doctor responded after turning back. "The man that brought my daughter to this hospital, is he tall, dark, with a white beard?" "Yes, I think that's exactly his description. That is the description of the man who had brought your daughter here. He came with a black jeep having a bull bar." "How did you know?" the doctor asked inquisitively. Mr. Bright took a step backwards and folded his lips, trying to keep in the tears that were building up. "Doctor, the man just left this hospital a few minutes ago. He drove in and I saw him, but I didn't have the courage to go and confront him," Mr. Bright said with so much regret. The doctor heaved a heavy sigh. He assured Mr. Bright that the man would definitely come again looking for them. He told Mr. Bright not to tell his wife about it for her own sake, and then he walked away. Mr. Bright stood confused for a while. He didn't know who he was going to call to stay with his wife. His wife's sister stayed in Ghana with her husband. Mr. Bright walked slowly to where his wife was. He lifted her up and walked with her to the pharmacy. He bought the prescribed drugs and left the hospital. When he got home, he served the food he had taken earlier from the eatery, and he tried making his wife to eat because she hadn't eaten for more than 24 hours. He couldn't give her drugs without food. Sandra sat looking at the food in front of her and the drugs on the table, and tears rolled down her cheeks. Back at the hospital where Naomi was being revived by the doctor, immediately Tina dropped the call with her husband. The doctor walked out of the room with a nurse. Tina ran towards him with Deborah. She then asked how the little girl was doing. The doctor said that everything was okay with Naomi. She was just readjusting because of the surgery that took place. He assured her that all was well and they could go see Naomi because she was awake. Tina held her chest and let out a deep breath. "Thank you, doctor," Tina said, and rushed into the room with her friend Deborah. Naomi lay down on the bed and tears rolled down from the corners of her eyes. Tina knew Naomi was shedding tears because she was trying to understand what was going on, but she couldn't. Tina told Deborah to stay with Naomi while she would go and find what she was going to eat. Few minutes later, Tina came with a plate of food. She made Naomi sit up and she started feeding her. Tina found joy with every spoon of food she put into Naomi's mouth. Naomi was hungry and she finished the whole food Tina bought. Deborah could feel the love emitting from Tina's eyes as she fed Naomi. The ladies were lost in excitement and didn't hear as Tina's phone kept ringing inside her bag. It was Mr. David calling. He drove at a high speed. He wanted to see things for himself. He drove for a long time and his phone started ringing. He tried to pick the phone up from the passenger seat and it fell down from his hand due to anxiety. He reduced his speed and then reached out for his phone. It was his wife calling. He picked up the call anxiously. His wife told him that Naomi was okay and out of danger. It was as if cold water was poured on Mr. David's head when he heard those words from his wife. It was already late and he had left the city already. He really wanted to see Naomi with his eyes and know how she was faring. When Mr. David arrived in his own city, he drove directly to the hospital. When he arrived at the hospital, something shocking happened. As soon as he turned off the ignition key, he felt as if something was behind his seat. He turned back and it was Naomi's uniform lying on top of his back seat. Mr. David came down from his car and went towards the back seat to confirm. It was really Naomi's school uniform. But how? I thought... Mr. David began to wonder if he was actually seeing right. It was so surprising to him. He left the uniform inside the car and entered the hospital. Tina was alone with Naomi, who was sleeping soundly. Mr. David told his wife Tina about the missing uniform of the little girl that suddenly appeared back inside his car. Tina told Mr. David to come show her the uniform. When they both came outside and opened Mr. David's car, the school uniform was gone. They found out it was missing. The school uniform was nowhere to be found. "Where is the uniform?" Tina asked in awe as she stared inside the empty car. "It was right there. I left it there. I saw it before coming to call you." Tina said to Mr. David, "I'm not sure you know what you're talking about." Mr. David screamed, almost driven to madness by disbelief. "Honey, I am certain I left the school uniform right here, at the back of the car. I saw it before locking the car and entering the hospital to see you. How could it have disappeared? No one else has my car key. Who could have placed and removed the school uniform?" Mr. David fell to the ground, gasping for air. Tina was shocked, lost in thoughts, and stood motionless without saying a word. Mr. David could not endure it anymore. He fell to the ground and fainted. Tina screamed and called out for help. The patient care assistants arrived and took Mr. David into the hospital, where he was placed on treatment immediately. After some hours, Mr. David woke up and found himself lying on the hospital bed, with Tina sitting very close to him. Tina said to Mr. David, "The doctor said you've been stressed. I think that is why you have begun to see things. I think you're stressed out. You know, you haven't had proper sleep since yesterday, and I think it is making you see things. Maybe you misplaced the uniform." But Mr. David knew what he saw. He had seen the uniform earlier before it disappeared. He kept wondering if actually his wife was saying the truth, that his mind was playing tricks on him. "Let's go see the doctor," Tina said to her husband. Mr. David got up from the bed. He joined his wife to go see the doctor. When they entered the doctor's office, they asked him if Naomi was okay. The doctor told them that they were free to go back with Naomi. He only told them what to avoid if they wanted her to get better quickly. Don't allow your daughter to be around things that will make her unhappy. She needs to be happy always to help her heal faster, the doctor said to Mr. David and Tina. Mr. David wanted to tell the doctor that Naomi wasn't theirs, but it felt as if something asked him not to. Mr. David thanked the doctor and paid all the necessary bills which were in the receipt. He also made sure he bought the necessary drugs from the pharmacy. Then he left the hospital with his wife and Naomi. That night, after dinner, Mr. David retired to bed with his wife, Tina. They took Naomi into Pascal's room. It was still intact after 2 years. Pascal passed away. None of Pascal's belongings were thrown away or given out. It was as if he never left. Tina always took her time to arrange the room and keep it clean. Whenever she felt the need to be with a child, she goes in there. "Honey?" Tina called her husband as they both lay in bed. "Yes, dear." "Will you still go looking for her parents tomorrow?" Mr. David took a while, and then he heaved a sigh. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "I'm so confused. It seems like something is keeping me from finding the little girl's parents, and I just cannot explain it," he said, staring at the ceiling. "I know it will sound selfish, but why don't we keep her? For her to have encountered an accident means her parents are not rich enough. We may give her back and they won't be able to take care of her health issues. Let's keep her till she fully recovers and regains her memory." "Do you think giving her up after getting attached is going to be easy?" Mr. David asked, moving his gaze to his wife. "I don't know," Tina answered. It was a long night for the couple. Mr. David kept trying to figure out what has made the school uniform disappear, till the sweet arms of sleep took them off. The next day, Mr. David woke up very early and went to check on Naomi. She was sleeping peacefully. He got ready for work and left the house. Tina stayed at home because she wanted to keep an eye on Naomi for a while. Naomi was having her breakfast when Deborah walked in after Tina opened the door for her. She had called Tina to ask about Naomi, and Tina told her she would be at home the next day. Naomi greeted Deborah in a sweet voice which was almost inaudible, and Deborah responded. Deborah dragged Tina by her hand out of where Naomi was seated. She asked her softly what was her next plan with Naomi,
since she was already better. Tina told Deborah that they planned on keeping Naomi till she recovers fully. I knew it. I saw the way you were feeding that little girl at the hospital. But let me tell you, Tina, you are my friend and I can't give you bad advice. Return this little girl to her parents. You are a mother and you know what you went through when you lost Pascal. Don't talk about Pascal, Tina said immediately, cutting off words from Deborah. How do you intend we find her parents? She can't even remember herself. She needs intensive care and I'm going to give it to her. This has nothing to do with Pascal, Tina said, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Back at Naomi's parents. Mommy? Mommy? Naomi's sweet voice called out to Sandra. Sandra quickly turned, and there was Naomi in her school uniform, smiling at her. She was holding her lunchbox, and her smile was so cute as she shook her head slowly from left to right, showing a bit of her teeth. Sandra spread her arms wide for Naomi to run into them with so much joy. Naomi sprinted forward towards Sandra. Suddenly, an invincible force stopped Naomi from reaching out to Sandra. Sandra couldn't explain what was happening. She then tried running towards Naomi, but she couldn't. The invisible force then took the form of a man. It held Naomi and dragged her backwards, while Naomi kept crying for her mother. Give me my child. Give me Naomi back, please. She's all I have. Sandra kept shouting and crying out bitterly.
She's never coming back to you,
the man without a face said in a coarse voice. Naomi suddenly stopped crying. The man smiled at her and she smiled back. The man held Naomi by her hand and walked away with her. Sandra couldn't understand what was going on. She tried running after them. She slipped and fell down. Naomi! She shouted as tears ran down her cheeks. Sandy, Sandy! Mr. Bright kept calling and tapping Sandra. Sandra woke up and it was just a dream, but it felt so real to her. He said he won't give her back to me. He took her. They took my daughter. They took Naomi. Please bring her back. Sandra cried out, sobbing bitterly. Who took our daughter? Did you see any face? He asked, still holding her. No, I didn't see any face. He had no face. He said my daughter is no longer mine. He took my daughter. He took Naomi. Sandra said and continued sobbing. Mr. Bright kept consoling his wife, who won't stop crying. She stood up and tried leaving the room, but Mr. Bright won't let her. He didn't trust her judgment anymore. She was slowly losing it. He dragged her slowly back to the bed. Mr. Bright didn't know who to call at such a time. He decided to call his mother, since Sandra's mother was no more. Mr. Bright's mother picked up the call. She tried consoling Sandra over the phone. Ever since Naomi got missing, she had always called them to know if there was an update. Mr. Bright told his mother about Sandra's dream. He told her about the faceless man Sandra saw in her dream that took Naomi. Did you say a faceless man? His mother asked over the phone. Yes, she said the man was faceless. Hello, Mama. Mr. Bright kept saying over the phone without getting a response. It turned out his mother switched the call on hearing about the faceless man. Back at Mr. David's office, Mr. David was seated in his office, but his mind was not at rest. He kept thinking about what he had discussed with his wife. He began to pace around inside his office. Mr. David really wanted to find Naomi's parents, but he couldn't tell what was really stopping him. He didn't want to get attached to Naomi because giving her up would be more difficult. Keeping her too won't be a good decision because he could already feel the love his wife had for Naomi. Things got confusing for Mr. David. His mind went back to the uniform that got missing and appeared back inside his car. He had arrived at the hospital but didn't enter because of the distress call from his wife. Nothing was really wrong with Naomi, and he drove all the way back. Denying his wife the right to console herself from the death of their only child, which she hadn't grown over, or taking back the child to the parents who were going through a lot because of their missing child. The decision was getting tougher and tougher for Mr. David. The doctor had also said Naomi stood a chance of losing her memory forever. What if she loses her memory forever? Mr. David asked himself and heaved a sigh. Meanwhile, back at David's home, Tina and her friend Deborah was still having a heated conversation on whether to keep Naomi or return her to her parents. I'm so sorry, Tina. I know what you're thinking. You call me a bad friend for talking to you about all this. I just feel the little girl's parents need to know that their daughter is okay. I really can't help it if my daughter was knocked down. The pains of losing a child is... Please stop it, Deborah. Please. Can you leave my house? I plead with you. Don't open old wounds, Debbie. Just go. Tina pleaded, trying to hold in the building tears. It's okay. I will go, Deborah said and picked up her handbag. I'm sorry, Tina. Pascal, just leave, please, Tina said, holding her hands together and cutting Deborah's words. As soon as Deborah left the house, Tina ran into Pascal's room. She shut the door behind her and then lay on his bed. Sweet memories that she had shared with her son came playing inside her mind. Tina lay on Pascal's bed, holding his bedspread and crying her eyes out. She only wished her son was still alive. Why didn't you take me too, God? Why did you bring her into my life? Why are you torturing me? Do I really deserve all these pains? Tina asked, crying her eyes out. The more she tried to hold in the tears, the more it streamed down her cheeks. Back at Naomi's house, Mr. Bright, Naomi's father, was still trying to reach out to his mother who had hanged up the call earlier. Hello, Mama. Are you still there? My son, I don't think this is what we can talk about over the phone. Can you come back to the village tomorrow with your wife? I think there is something I really need to show you. Mama, you are really making me and my wife anxious. Tell me what you know about her dream and the faceless man, please. It's a long story, my son. Please come back to the village as soon as possible. Mr. Bright slowly brought the phone down from his ears and hung up the call. He looked at his wife, who seemed more worried than he was. Sleep didn't go through their eyes again as they kept wondering why Mama will ask them to come back to the village and who the faceless man was. Mr. Bright and his wife began preparing for their impromptu travel to the village. When they were done, they left their house very early. Mr. Bright's village was just a few hours from the city. When they arrived, his mother was seated outside on a bench like she had been waiting for them. Sandra greeted her mother-in-law with tears running down her cheeks. She stood up from the little bench she was sitting on and hugged Sandra. Since it was an emergency matter, Mama told them to sit with her on the little bench outside. Mama, please, I and my wife are curious. Tell us about the faceless man and what he wants with our little princess. Mama heaved a sigh and then turned towards her son. My son, many years ago, I was heavily pregnant with you when my late husband, your father, was into a land dispute with 3 men. They all claimed ownership of your father's land. Your father called his uncles to help him, but they all turned their back on him. I pleaded with your father to let the lands go, but he told me he wouldn't let his father's sweat be in vain. When all hopes were beginning to fade away, your father took me to the land at night. In front of the biggest tree inside the land, your father made a promise to the tree. He told the tree that if he takes over the land as the rightful owner, he was going to dedicate all his future generations to it, starting from the one I had in my womb. Then your father cut himself with a sharp object and smeared the blood on the trunk of the tree. Those who had come to drag the land with your father came begging him. They said a faceless being was chasing them all around, even in their dreams. One of them died because he tried to stay and continue fighting. Your father took over all the land for himself. When you were born, your father dedicated you to the tree. It's been so many years your father died, and I had already forgotten about it. When you called me and told me about the faceless man in your wife's dream, it took me down the memory lane. My son, I think that it was the faceless man that caused the accident which Naomi got involved in. I think it wants to take the child away from you and your wife for not dedicating her to him, Mama said in a convincing voice. It all began to make sense to Mr. Bright. He couldn't explain how he had suddenly forgotten to take his daughter back from school. He always went there earlier than the normal time. Neither could Sandra explain why there was a sudden traffic that got her phone stolen. None of them remembered to call the school to tell them they would be coming later than usual. Naomi was a very smart girl, and her leaving the school without waiting for them also made sense. Of all the hospitals in the city, his daughter was transferred to another city which they know not about. Even Mr. Bright began to understand why the man who had knocked his daughter would come to meet them in the hospital and go back. How can a tree torment my life? Where was the tree when I and my wife were looking for a child? After waiting on God for a child, Mama, you are telling me a tree is in charge of my daughter's disappearance. You and Papa dedicated me to a tree? Mr. Bright said, fuming with anger. He stood up from the bench, entered into the house and came out with a machete. I am going to bring that tree down today. I want it to show me its powers, he said and walked out with the machete. Mama begged her son not to cause any harm to the tree. She told him to appease it for it to bring their daughter back. But Mr. Bright already made up his mind. He arrived where the tree was and yelled at the tree and started cutting the tree. By the time Sandra and Mama would get to where Mr. Bright was, he had already started digging his machete into the tree. After a few minutes of cutting into the tree, Mr. Bright's hand began to shake. He adjusted his hand and continued cutting. Then his hand started shaking vigorously. The machete fell off from his hand. Mr. Bright was just staring at his hands, and sweat which gathered all over his face started dropping on the ground. His legs began to tremble, and he started breathing heavily. He turned to look at his wife and his mother, who were staring at him. And then he fell down.
Oh my God, I'm finished! Sandra shouted and ran towards her husband with Miriam. Mr. Bright was on the floor, shaking. His eyes were opened and he just lay there shaking and staring at his wife. Sandra cried out bitterly and tears ran down her cheeks.
Don't do this to me. Please stand up. You're making me scared. Please get up.
Sandra said with tears, trying to lift her husband up with Mama, but they couldn't. Mama ran out and saw some guys who were passing by. She asked for their help to lift her son from the ground. Those guys saw Mr. Bright's condition. They quickly carried him up and took him to Mama's house as instructed. Mr. Bright was carried into the house and kept on an old bed inside the room. Mama thanked the guys and they left, wondering what must have kept Mr. Bright in such a condition inside his own land. Sandra sat on the bed beside her husband. Just looking at him sent tears running down her cheeks.
We came here for a solution. We came here because of Naomi. Why didn't you just listen to Mama? I just hope we'll see our charming princess again. I don't want to think about it. Just get up. Let's look for a solution together.
Sandra continued saying in tears. Mr. Bright just lay on the bed, unable to speak. He couldn't even lift a finger up. He was completely paralyzed. He just continued looking at his wife and tears rolled down from the sides of his eyes. Tears ran down Mama's cheeks. It's been over so many decades and she had never remembered about the faceless man. She never knew he still existed. She was confused and didn't know what to do. She didn't know how her husband discovered the powers in the tree. He had just taken her there that day and he took the oath. She didn't know what she could do to appease the tree for what her son had just done. Mama, what should we do? I don't want to lose my husband, please. Sandra said, still shedding tears. I don't know of any native doctor who is as strong as the faceless man. I think we need to look for a pastor who can help pray against this deity that my late husband created for himself. Mama said, looking at her son who was suffering. Mama, tell me the nearest church so I can go immediately. I don't want my husband to die. I don't want him to die, Sandra said in tears. Mama directed Sandra to one of the church at the junction. It was quite a big church. Sandra wiped her tears and ran towards the church. When she arrived, she was lucky to meet up with the senior pastor inside the church. He was manipulating his phone. She fell at the pastor's feet and told him the short story about how her husband had gone to cut down a tree and got paralyzed. The pastor told Sandra to wipe her tears because she was at the right place, but that before they leave, she had to pay deliverance and consultation fee. Sandra was desperate and ready to pay anything. She transferred some amount of money into the church account in tears. When she was done, the pastor called two other pastors and left with them to Mr. Bright's house. After seeing Mr. Bright's condition, he asked to be taken to the evil tree which had paralyzed Mr. Bright. Sandra took the pastors to the tree. When they arrived, the pastor said some words of prayer and picked up the machete from the ground. Something unexpected happened. The pastor went closer to the tree with the machete he had picked up. He was filled with fear because of Mr. Bright, who had made a cut on the tree and was paralyzed. But as a pastor,
he mustered up courage and said some words of prayers. He raised up the machete and made a cut on the trunk of the tree. Nothing happened to him. Then his courage rose.
Someone say, this tree must go down.
The pastor said with so much joy.
This tree must go down.
His fellow pastors repeated after him. Then he raised the machete high up this time. With so much strength, he made a deep cut into the tree. He also let out a loud cry immediately the machete landed on the tree. My leg! My leg! The pastor shouted in pains. His fellow pastors were all surprised, and all were looking at him to know what had happened. The pastor looked at his trousers, and it was already soaked with blood. He slowly lifted up his trousers in tears, only to see a huge cut on his leg, with blood pouring out. The pastor fell on the ground and started crying out in pains. My leg, oh! Please help me. Oh my God! Fear gripped the other pastors. They were scared to come close to the pastor who was on the ground crying in pains. They both kept pushing each other to know who was going to help the pastor. A sensational wind began to blow, and the weather started changing. The atmosphere was turning dark. A strange whistle accompanied with strange whispers were heard. A man without a face walked out of the tree. The pastors left their Bible and took to their heels, leaving the senior pastor who was crying out and calling them back. Sandra was scared, but the need to see her daughter and save her husband was even far greater than her fear. She knelt down in front of the being in tears. Please, forgive my husband. Please, I am so sorry. No one told us we were to dedicate our daughter to you. Please bring back my daughter and heal my husband. I'll dedicate her to you, I promise. Sandra said in tears. Blood. Only blood can appease me. The blood of an innocent child. Else he dies and the child never comes back to you. The voice echoed from the tree. The faceless being returned and walked towards the tree. No, please, forgive us. Please, I can't lose my family. Please have mercy, please. Sandra continued pleading in tears to the being who didn't seem interested in her pleas. It walked back into the tree without uttering a word, and the climatic condition changed and everywhere became bright again. Sandra looked beside her, and the pastor who was crying out in pain was lying down dead. It seemed like he had bled out on the spot because of how deep the cut was. Sandra cried out and ran out of the land. She ran home in tears. She entered the house with tears rolling down her cheeks. Mama stood up anxiously, trying to know what had happened. Mama, he's asking for blood. Blood of an innocent child. How can I kill someone's child for mine? What about the pastor? Mama asked inquisitively. The pastor is dead. He is dead. Sandra cried out painfully. Mama carried her hands on her head. She had warned her husband to let go of the land so many years ago, but he didn't heed her advice. All this wouldn't have happened if he had let go. If the popular pastor in the village just lost his life, then who was going to save them? Mama, I can't lose my family. You won't die. You won't die, Sandra said, hugging her husband and sobbing bitterly. While Mr. Bright just lay still, tears rolled down from the corners of his eyes. Sandra wiped off the tears that were rolling down the sides of her husband's eyes. You won't die. You won't die. I won't let anything happen to you, okay? She said convincingly to her husband, who just lay still without uttering a word. Mama, Sandra called out to Miriam. Do you know of any strong witch doctor? I can't let anything happen to my husband, and I can't stain my hands with blood. I don't even know where I'm going to get the blood of an innocent child, Sandra said, wiping her tears. I think, yes, I have heard of a very strong witch doctor. I haven't visited him, neither do I know where he stays, but I know someone who can take me there. I've heard so much about his greatness. Mama, please, go and get him, please. Ask for where he stays. I want my husband to be well again, please. Mama immediately tied her head with a scarf, left to go and get the witch doctor. She left, leaving Sandra all alone with Mr. Bright. Mr. Bright was not happy that his mother was going to get a witch doctor. He only believed God was the only one who could get them out of the mess they found themselves. He only regretted acting in a haste. Only if I had followed this accordingly and not acted on impulse. Mr. Bright kept regretting his actions. He tried so hard to tell his wife to call his mother back, but he couldn't. He couldn't move any part of his body, including his lips. The more he tried, the more tears rolled down the sides of his cheeks. Sandra, who didn't get the signs her husband was giving, kept trying to wipe the tears off. But she couldn't help but join him, sobbing bitterly and hoping for the best. Miriam took quite a long time. It was already getting dark. Finally, Mama came with the witch doctor to the house. With the help of his helper, Mr. Bright was brought out of the room and laid on the floor outside the house. The witch doctor stared at Mr. Bright. He stood still for a while. Then he started making some incantations continuously. After a while, he lifted something which looked like a bone tied with red ropes. He carefully placed it on Mr. Bright's forehead. Immediately he did that, a strange whistle began to blow around the vicinity. Then strange whispers could be heard all around the building. It got darker. Sandra knew the faceless man was coming because the same thing happened earlier with the pastor. Show your face. Show yourself. The witch doctor said out loud and started making some incantations continuously. He began to blow some whitish powdered stuffs around the building. A strong wind carried the witch doctor high up and allowed him to fall on the ground. The witch doctor fell with a great thud to the ground. He quickly picked his things and took to his heels, running off like someone who had broken his legs. Please, we are sorry. I don't know where I can get the blood of an innocent child. Please show us your mercy. Sandra kept pleading in tears as the whistling and the whispers dispersed and everywhere became calm. Mr. Bright suddenly started shaking vigorously. Sandra ran to where her husband laid and tried holding him. Mr. Bright was now able to talk. His lips were bent towards a corner. Please, find a place in your heart to forgive my family for everything we are putting you through. I'm so sorry. Forgive me, Sandy. Mr. Bright said, Holy, please, stop it. Please, you are not going anywhere. What will become of me? If you want me to forgive you, then stand up. Stand up and let us go look for our princess, Sandra said, sobbing bitterly and dragging her husband by his shirt. Promise me you will run to God. Promise me you will never dedicate our daughter to that thing, Mr. Bright said slowly, while Sandra kept shaking her head and sobbing painfully. Mr. David wasn't at peace keeping Naomi. It was as if something was keeping him from returning Naomi. He wondered why he had become selfish. He was the one who knocked her down and also keeping her from her parents. He only wondered what her parents were going through. The school uniform, which disappeared mysteriously, was still a mystery to be solved to Mr. David. Tina, on the other hand, kept remembering what Deborah told her, and she also wondered why she couldn't bring herself to let go of Naomi, knowing fully well what a mother would go through when her child is missing. What if the little girl regains her memory? How will the girl see her when she finds out what she did? But then, why did God allow her to come into their lives? Why did he make the accident to affect her memory? Tina had so many questions, but no one to answer them. Mr. Bright coughed continuously, and blood mixed with some saliva flew out of his mouth. Miriam held her son, wiping off his mouth with her wrapper. White tears kept streaming down her cheeks. Then, an idea struck Sandra immediately. She can't sit around doing nothing and watching her husband die. Mama, do we have a Bible in this house? Sandra asked, wiping off her tears. Yes, I have one, yes. Miriam answered and ran into the house. She came out with a big Bible. Sandra collected the Bible from her and placed it on her husband's chest. She took his 2 hands and placed it on top of the Bible. Then tears began to roll down Sandra's cheeks. Father, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Lord. Forgive your daughter. I lost my daughter and a part of me got missing too. Father, please, don't let me be a widow at such a young age. Please, oh merciful God. Sandra kept pleading with her hands also on the Bible, while crying out buckets of tears. The whistling and strange whispers came again, this time even louder than before. Mr. Bright started jerking vigorously. He was trying to say something, but he couldn't. Sandra and Miriam tried holding him, begging him not to die on them, while tears streamed down their cheeks. Suddenly, Mr. Bright stopped shaking and became cold. Tina fixed dinner for everyone. They were all eating in a moody environment. Both Tina and David had suddenly developed guilty conscience for keeping Naomi. Are you my mother and father? What is my name? Naomi asked the couple slowly and abruptly. Mr. David and Tina didn't expect the question. They both stared at each other. We are... Just eat your food, my dear. You need a lot of rest. We will tell you all you need to know tomorrow, Tina said with a smile, cutting her husband's word. Naomi nodded her head and continued eating. After the food, Tina took Naomi back to Pascal's room, while she retired to bed with her husband. They both couldn't find sleep. Tina's thoughts kept racing against each other. Mr. David decided he would present the matter to his pastor for counseling, since the next day was a church service. The next day, the couple prepared and left for service with Naomi. People kept staring at Mr. David and Tina as they walked in with a little girl. Many of them knew Pascal was no more and the couple had no child, so they wondered if they had adopted a child. Mr. David didn't want to leave Naomi in the children's section
because of the stern warning the doctor gave him. During the worship time, a music minister had come to the church. During his ministration, he said God had sent him to come. He raised spirit-filled songs which sent the atmosphere changing and charging. Within a few minutes, both Mr. David and Tina had a feeling that something had left them. They began to have the sudden hunger to return Naomi back to her parents. When the service was over, Mr. David and Tina went to meet their pastor with Naomi. Mr. David narrated everything to the pastor. He also told him how the uniform with which he wanted to use to find Naomi's parents suddenly disappeared. His pastor, Jude, read some scriptures to the couple and told them that their decision to take Naomi back to her parents was the best. But he also warned them to be prayerful, because the uniform which kept disappearing wasn't ordinary. Mr. David told his pastor that he would be traveling the next day with Tina to go look for Naomi's parents, and also apologized to them for knocking down their daughter. Pastor said a few words of prayers with the couple and Naomi, and then he allowed them to leave. Mr. David, his wife, and Naomi went back home, and they began to prepare for their journey the next day. At night, Tina felt sober. She began to miss Naomi. She had felt what it meant to be a mother once again, within the few days Naomi had spent with them. But she knew she was about to do the right thing. She called Deborah, her friend, on phone and apologized to her for walking her out of her house. She told Deborah that she had realized her mistake and that she would be taking Naomi back to her parents. Deborah was so happy for the decision her friend made, and she forgave her. Very early in the next morning, the couple were still asleep. Mr. David's phone started ringing. He woke up to check who would be calling him so early in the morning. It was the pastor calling him. Mr. David picked the call anxiously to know why his pastor was calling him so early in the morning. "Good morning, sir," Mr. David said. "God bless you, Brother David. I was praying for the members of the church very early this morning when God revealed something to me. Tell me, sir, if you embark on the journey to return that little girl, everyone inside the car will lose their life in a fatal accident." Immediately, Mr. Bright became cold. Mr. Bright's heart had stopped beating. Sandra's eyes widened. She got frozen and tears just rolled down her face. Sandra looked up and then held the Bible tight on her husband's chest.
God, this isn't what you promised me. I can't be a widow at such a young age. Show your mercy, Father.
Sandra said out loud in pains as tears rolled down her cheeks. Suddenly, Mr. Bright took a deep breath and he opened his eyes. Mr. Bright came back to life immediately. Sandra was filled with joy, and so was Mama. They both held Mr. Bright tightly, and tears of joy kept running down their cheeks. Sandra thanked God gratefully and only hoped her husband gets healed from the afflictions of the faceless man. "So I shouldn't take her back?" Mr. David asked the pastor. "No. I think some forces are trying to keep the little girl from getting to her parents. The powers are strong, but God is stronger. The little girl will be taken back to her parents. There's a ministration in my spirit to go with you. I'll wait for you to come pick me up." "Thank you so much, Pastor. God bless you," the pastor said. and hung up. The phone was on speak out, so Tina had everything. She immediately went to Pascal's room to check on Naomi. Naomi was sleeping soundly. She came back to her room and began to prepare. Within an hour, they were all ready to leave. Mr. David drove to the pastor's house in order to get the pastor to go to the journey with them. When they arrived, the pastor said some prayers holding their hands. Then he anointed the car and everyone inside. Then the journey began. Mr. David drove for hours. On getting to the entrance of the city, something mysterious happened. A lorry driver left his lane and started driving with so much speed towards Mr. David. It was as if the lorry's brake had failed. It drove directly towards Mr. David. Mr. David tried going off track, but it was as if something held his hand so tight so he could clash with the incoming lorry. Mr. David couldn't explain how it happened, but both his car and the lorry stopped without clashing into each other. The pastor came down and saw it and began to praise God because it was only a miracle from God. Because both cars stopped instantly in front of each other. Mr. David, his wife, and the pastor kept thanking God for saving their lives. Mr. David wanted to talk about the accident, but the pastor told him a bigger battle was up front and he should still be in faith. Mr. David drove straight to the hospital where he had taken Naomi to. He went to see the doctor, but unfortunately, neither Bright nor Sandra had left their number. Mr. David then thought about going to the police station when a nurse stopped them on their way out. She knew the headmistress of Naomi's school. She told Mr. David that she knew the school Naomi attended. Mr. David asked her to take her to the school. She joined them inside the car and directed them to the school. School was still in session and the gate was locked. The nurse knocked on the gate. The headmistress opened the gate when the nurse said she was the one that was knocking. The headmistress was surprised to see Naomi. She immediately carried her up in so much joy. Where did you see her? Were you the one that knocked her down? Thank God you're okay, my daughter. What? Please, can you help us call her parents? Mr. David calmly asked, cutting off all the questions the headmistress had. The headmistress had Sandra's number. She dialed it and it was switched off. Then she remembered that Sandra had lost her phone the same day Naomi got missing. She asked some of the teachers if they knew Naomi's house. One of the teachers knew her house, so the teacher left with Mr. David and the others towards Sandra's house. On arrival, they were told by the neighbors that Mr. Bright had traveled to the village with his wife in search of a solution for their missing daughter. Mr. David thought about what he was going to do next. Going back was not an option. It was better they return Naomi before her parents would do something they would regret. Pastor Jude told Mr. David that God just ministered something to him. He needed to get to Mr. Bright's village before things would get out of hand. Mr. David asked for Mr. Bright's village, his full name, and luckily for them, Mr. Bright's village was just the next village after that of Tina. So they set off and drove towards his village. It wasn't that far. It took barely 2 hours and they got there. Mr. David started looking for Mr. Bright's compound and he was well directed because of his surname. On getting to Mr. Bright's compound, there was Mr. Bright lying down outside with Sandra who was sitting beside him. She was struggling to feed him after he had refused to eat. The black Lexus parked inside the compound, and Mr. David came down from his car. He walked towards Sandra. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Is this Bright Umebi's compound?" Mr. David asked. "Yes, this is my husband, and I am his wife, Sandra," she said. "We are in the right place," Mr. David said out loud, and the pastor came down from the car. So did Tina and Naomi. Sandra tilted her head to see who was coming from the car, and it was her charming princess, Naomi. She immediately jumped up. "Our princess is back! She's back!" Sandra shouted and ran towards Naomi with tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. She hugged Naomi tightly and started laughing and crying at the same time. She dragged Naomi and went towards her husband. "Our charming princess is here. Stand up and lift her up like you do," Sandra said with tears in her eyes. Suddenly, there was a great change of the atmosphere, and a great whistling sound was heard. The whispering came slowly and added velocity with time. "This is it. It's here. I can feel the evil aura," the pastor stayed, standing his ground and holding his Bible. He began to make declarations from the scriptures and sprinkling the whole environment with the anointing oil. He made the environment so hot for the faceless deity to even enter. As the sounds dispersed, Miriam walked in, so surprised at what was going on inside her compound. She was so happy and delighted seeing her granddaughter again. The pastor asked everyone to remain in the house while Miriam would take him to the root of the evil. Miriam took the pastor to the land where the tree was. The pastor arrived in front of the tree and made so many bold declarations with scriptural backups. He asked Miriam to denounce the deity, which she did. Then he ordered Miriam to go and get boys who will cut down the tree. As Miriam ran off to go get the boys, the pastor continued praying. The faceless man walked out of the tree with blood dripping down his hands. It looked so weak. It fell down and disappeared. Yet, Pastor Jude kept praying. It took a while. Then the boys came and cut down the tree. By the time Miriam would get home with the pastor, her son, Mr. Bright, was already sitting down on a chair outside, looking so healthy and strong again. She ran in and hugged him with so much happiness. Mr. David already explained everything to the couple, and they forgave him because they knew it was the manipulation of the faceless man. Naomi had divinely gotten back her memory, but the last thing she remembered was that she was sitting down and waiting for her parents in front of the school's gate. Pastor Jude told the family to always put God first and desist from idol worshipping, which can put the future generations at risk. Mr. David and his wife exchanged contacts with Mr. Bright and his wife, and they became family friends. Mr. Bright lost his job when he went back to the city because of his absence from work for days. Mr. David got him a better paying job with his connections. A year later, God blessed Mr. David and Tina with a beautiful baby girl who they named Pascaline. After 3 years, Mr. Bright had a son who he named Pascal, while Mr. David gave birth to another boy who he named Bright. Mr. David invited Mr. Bright for his son's dedication service. Mr. Bright and his wife, who now owned a car, courtesy of Mr. David, drove all the way to Mr. David's city to honor the invitation. During the sermon, the pastor talked about causes we may not know about, which keeps us in bondage, and also the importance of being good. Sandra and Tina were staring at their children with so much joy in their hearts. Who would have thought they would be the mothers of children again? The moral lesson of this story reminds us that sometimes decisions that we take because of greed or the need, the urge to hold onto material things might have effect in generations to come. But we must always remember that God Almighty still has power over all powers on earth. The end.